Greetings, fellow time travellers, wherever you are. Time for another inspiring chat, an opportunity to chew the fat with someone who will enlighten us about a darkening world. But before we get there, a quick reminder about my patreon.com site. It's by going to patreon.com and searching for me by name and parting with a little bit of cash, monthly or annually, that you help to support and finance the channel and what Paul and I try to do here. You get exclusive access to exclusive content. It's a great site, and you'll make it better just by stirring yourself into the mix. Okay, enough of the advertising, time for the interview. Welcome everyone, time for another interview, another conversation with someone whose insight, I hope and believe, will add to the sum of our collective wisdom on various interesting topics. The guest in question is Professor Angus Dalgleish, a highly credentialed expert in the treatment of cancer. Professor Dalgleish has been involved in that field for decades. More recently, he's been a very outspoken, a very strong voice about many aspects of the official response to the events of the past 3 or 4 years. One of very few within his profession to have stood up and spoken out and asked questions and pointed out matters of concern and very real dangers to health. So welcome to you, Professor Angus Dalgleish.
Thank you.
We've spoken before, Professor, many times, but in recent months, I don't know, it might even be years now, you've pointed to worrying trends in relation to increased incidence of cancer, or indeed to the acceleration of cancer in those for whom the disease had been under control. With that in mind, what's the most up-to-date picture you can give us now as you understand it?
Right. Well, the first thing is, right from the word go, when they were talking about lockdowns, I said, do not do a lockdown. It would be an absolute disaster. This is a respiratory disease, just like flu, etc. We know that they never work. So why were they introduced? They only work if it's a disease like Ebola that's touching surfaces. We knew from day one this was a respiratory virus. This was a coronavirus, just like the cold. It'd been heavily engineered to make it very infectious. I will admit that, but lockdown was never going to make any difference to this, and I've been shown to be completely correct. I said at the time, and I had contact with people in the cabinet, and said, Angus Dalgleish, who's a bit the hero really at Sweden, in spite of 2,000 of his colleagues asking that he be struck off and sacked, he stood by his guns, and he's got the lowest death rate in the whole of the Western world, because they didn't have the lockdown. Now, why am I stressing this? Because I said, as an oncologist, sitting in my clinic, seeing patients and outpatients all the time, if you lock down, we will not be getting that level of screening for the patients. They will not be coming with their early lesion. They will not be getting the rapid intervention, investigation and intervention. And as it's happened, this was true. We found patients weren't even coming to the hospital to get regular scans because they were frightened they'd catch COVID. And they said that this will actually make things worse because the cancers will inevitably appear, but they will be delayed, they will be worse, and then we'll end up with a tsunami of cancer. So I really want to make that clear. This was the first thing that I was pointing out, that the cancer problem would be a problem just because of the lockdown. And my colleague and friend Carol Sikora was singing from exactly the same hymn book here. So you would have thought they might have listened to us, but oh no, all our correspondence, certainly mine, they didn't even reply to it, or just a cursory thank you, that's it. There was no need for a discussion or scientific debate. Now, the thing that you just asked me about was the sudden realization that when I was doing my melanoma clinics, I was in a very, I would say, lucky situation that I stumbled across immunotherapy decades ago, and I had several melanoma patients who I'd basically induced. There had been stage 4 melanoma, and induced them so that they basically had no cancer and were disease-free. It was quite remarkable, and normally they would always relapse. And they were going on for years and years, and all of a sudden, 6 of these patients who'd been stable for between 5 and 15 years, they all presented with relapse. And 1 or 2 of them, it was quite aggressive. So I want to know why. And I'm used to this having occurred rarely, but each time it's occurred in the past, the patients had very severe depression from bereavement or divorce or bankruptcy or something like that. And if this goes on a few months, then we know that leads to immune suppression, and we've had this come out. However, in none of these patients was there any reason at all for any depression. They were all happy, going about their lives, no different from the last year, 2, 3 years. And so I pushed, what has happened? What did you have before this came out? And in all of them, I didn't need to be Sherlock. They all said they'd had a COVID vaccine booster because they'd been bullied into it by their GP, and a lot of my patients are co-managed because they live a long way away, or by the other doctor looking after them, saying, and they said, it was quite right, they said the NHS guidelines. So the NHS guidelines were getting doctors to bully their patients to have a vaccine, which I exploded about, because this booster vaccine was not necessary whatsoever, because one of the many papers that I'd actually published and distributed around right from the beginning was that this type of virus, if you do have a vaccine based on the spike protein, well, the first thing that they ignored was we said 80% of this spike protein, which all the vaccine makers use as their antigens for this virus, said 80% of it has the same homologies as you get in the human proteins. So you're bound to get highly significant side effects from it. In spite of contacting people at the very top, they decided to ignore all this. So I thought that really, really annoyed me. And then with another group of colleagues, we did a big review of all the viruses that had ever had vaccines against them that involved coronaviruses. And there are a lot in the animal world, I mean, in cats and other animals. But what we found out is that 20 years, they'd all failed. But not only did they all fail, but they were dangerous. I mean, they killed monkeys in the final thing, which we never went through. So that was an enormous big red flag. But we found that there was some very interesting, the data was there, but again, ignored. If you have a vaccine against the coronavirus and it works, inverted commas, produces and neutralizes antibodies, it doesn't work for very long because the virus has a mutation and variant, and the immune system cannot see it. It's very well described for these viruses. It's called antigenic sin or immunological imprinting. So once the immune system sees that virus, you can alter it all you like. It'll only see the first virus. And we pointed out this was highly likely to occur in the virus. Again, everybody ignored us. And the problem is that it was everybody was pursuing the same path, and therefore they felt they must be collectively correct. And this is what I found so irritating, when we just read the basic literature and it was all there. The people making the decisions had not read the basic literature. And there was another thing that this class of viruses and antibodies has, that when you do go in with a booster, you get lots of antibodies against a virus now which no longer exists. And remember, the virus mutates quite fast. It no longer exists. It has no use. And these antibodies are not only useless, but they latch on to the virus, do not neutralize or kill it, and bring it into the cell. So they actually enhance infection. So it's called antibody-dependent enhancement. We warned of this again in these early papers, and that's exactly what we saw. I mean, I just remember so well sitting in the clinic, wondering why the nurses and helpers, etc., were all going down with COVID again. And I was told, they've been like that ever since they had the booster. To me, it was obvious. The people who had the booster were actually getting COVID. whereas the people who didn't have the booster weren't getting COVID. And this observation has been confirmed by the Cleveland Clinic, showing that if you had the booster vaccine, you were 3.5 times more likely to get COVID than if you didn't.
Professor, as a medical professional, and therefore by definition, born and raised really in the belly of the beast, you've lived your entire professional career within the entity that's there to take care of people. Could you ever have predicted the way that the pursuit of medicine and the pursuit of health has evolved over that time?
No, I must say I couldn't. And I basically, like most people of my generation, had a sort of inherent trust in the system, that it was designed to do the best and it would call upon the best in order to help with the so-called really big pandemic, which in retrospect, and all the signs were there very early on, it wasn't a big pandemic at all. It was no more than a dreadful flu. It was made worse because the virus was initially very infectious because it had been engineered to be so and escape from the laboratory. Now, that simple observation, which to me is clear, it doesn't need debating. Anybody who knows what they're talking about can look at the sequences and realize that these sequences do not occur naturally, or if they do, they get edited. I mean, this is something that occurs. And yet, I was horrified, literally horrified, when Matt Ridley, who wrote a book called Viral, set out to find the origin of the virus, expecting it to be from a bat in a cave jumping onto a human and infecting them, but there were some reasons to suspect that early on, was horrified to find that this sort of closing down of ideas, people didn't really want to know. And he told me at a meeting that he'd asked senior fellows of the Royal Society, experts in these fields, if they had looked at the sequences to check these inserts that I and others had pointed out. And he told me, so that's what he said, they told me, there's no point, it's obviously come from a bat. You've got the bastion of science. Basically, the people saying there's no point looking at the evidence. Now, this attitude has just permeated everything, from the government to all the agencies to the profession, everything. And I found this really horrifying. And I only started to have some insight into it when I was going on a holiday, when we had one of those rare breaks between the lockdowns, and I was able to go on a holiday, and I found myself at the airport rebuying 1984 An Animal Farm. I bought them as a package and read it. And I don't need to tell you the rest. I suddenly thought this was a fiction book, not an accurate prophecy, because that's what it appears to me. It was literally Orwellian, the Ministry of Truth, and it was just unbelievable. I suddenly woke up what was going on, and then it occurred to me something that I would never ever even have considered. But then it occurred to me, wait a minute, everything I faced, being ignored, told to shut up, having all the evidence I presented, all the journals turned it down, saying, we've nothing against the science, but it's not in the public interest. I mean, why did Nature, Science, Lance, they all used the same words. This is like it was coordinated. And I suddenly realized that the other thing that I said, this is respiratory disease. It's terribly easy to treat. And I know this because I had a couple of friends who were so ill, they called me in the middle of the night. Well, like 5 a.m. or something like that. Not when I'm used to discussing, saying they were really ill, what should they do? And they'd had COVID. And I said, what anybody really should do, I said, they needed dosing up with vitamin D, which actually would have been, if I had been CMO, that's what I'd have done for the entire country, and I would say problem solved. They've got a really sore mouth. They need to gargle with aspirin and mouthwashes and things like that. it's a respiratory infection, so you squirt things up your nose you can buy from the chemist, intranasal things like interferon, polyacid lipids and things like that. If it's going to your chest, you can just take a Beckertide puffer, which any GP should have prescribed. If it goes further, you should have dexamethasone, which is the steroid. Now, I did this to friends who called me about this, and they all recovered within 24 hours just doing that, whereas they were so short of breath they had to sit up in bed. So these were serious. Yet, this is the point. The government was actually telling doctors not to do anything, not to do any first aid, to tell the patients to sit at home, and if it got really bad, go to the hospital, where they would automatically kill you by putting you on a ventilator, which is another piece of moronic assumption that you should treat basically what was an inflammation of the lungs by trying to force everything back in like you would do with a cardiac or pulmonary failure. So that we ordered tens of thousands of ventilators, and all the evidence shows all they did was kill people quicker. I mean, everything about this was badly thought out.
I have been listening to this conversation for years now, and to me, where the disease came from, and what it actually was, began to feel less important to me than the realization that it wasn't dangerous in that sort of pandemic sense. Like data coming out of, say, a country like Germany has shown that, that hospital admission in 2019, 2020 was actually at a record low. And nothing of interest, nothing of clinical interest happened until 2021. And as it was everywhere, the average age at death was 82, 83, which is at life expectancy or beyond. And so whatever it was, whether it was produced by a one-night stand between a pangolin and a bat, or whether it was, however it was engineered in a lab or escaped, it wasn't killing people in the way that we were being invited to imagine that it was. And that's what got me. And then when you invoke the Orwellian aspect of it, 1984 and so on, that's what I found truly frightening. Because in amongst the way in which I've woken up to so much, I almost felt as though George Orwell must have been a time traveller. It almost felt as though he had come forward to 2024 and then gone back to write 1984. It was or that governments around the world had begun using it not as a warning or a prophecy, but as some kind of instruction manual. That was the aspect of it. As a non-scientist, it was those aspects that so frightened me and made me waken up, because I have realised that I am now, never mind vaccine hesitant, I now have an anxiety about needing to be treated for something serious, full stop. I worry about blood transfusions. I worry about what would have been the origin of things that might be introduced to my body in the name of treating it. And I think if that's happened to me, I wonder at the level of loss of trust and anxiety that's out there in the general population about the medical profession, full stop.
Well, I mean, I agree totally. As I said, that I could not understand why people that I knew were meant to be physicians and scientists were making such stupid, asinine decisions or going along with it. Now, I noticed actually when I went into an awful lot of deep research that occasionally, some of the people, one of the people, I hold Chris Whitty responsible for this. I think he's that had he done his job, we wouldn't have had all this. He was basically, I don't know, pressure was put on because he said some sensible things, but ignored them. He said you can't justify an emergency vaccine rollout for something that doesn't kill 30% of the population. And yet we have a vaccine rollout when it's clearly established only 0.085% of the population are being killed, and they're all of an age 82, older than anything else that kills them. How on earth did he allow this to go? He should have basically stood up and said, you cannot do this, and resign. But clearly, he stopped. So he was, I believe he should not have been in that job. I think it's absolutely appalling. And that has to be the weak thing. You have to own what you're there for. You cannot just put the blame on everybody else. But now I seriously believe, and here's me saying this, with everything that I've been through. I've been fellow of Royal Colleges, both here in Australia and the UK, the Academy of Medical Sciences. And I cannot understand that all my colleagues, etc., were all complicit and part of what clearly was a plan to put everything on hold until they rolled out a vaccine that, if they'd actually done the basic reading, they would have known it didn't work. It's very clear now, looking back, that the vaccine did not work and has actually been very dangerous and has caused far more problems, and it was not needed. This is the thing. It was not needed. So why was it pushed through? And this is where you have to follow the money. This to me, is unbridled influence and corruption that's been going on with Big Pharma and the governments. But they all did the same thing around the Western world. This is what was absolutely beyond belief, that they did all this. And they introduced draconian laws. They introduced a state of fear, which Laura Dodsworth is put so clearly in the book. I was horrified when I read that this was deliberate. Introduce a nudge unit, use it to manipulate the population so they are frightened and they'll do what they're told. This was all unbelievable. But I believe that this was so they could roll the vaccine out as the saviour. And that was Boris's big thing. We're the first to roll the vaccine out and save the world. And no, looking at the evidence, does it really do anything? And all the early data that suggests that there were lots of side effects and it wasn't nearly as effective as it was being said, that should have been gone over by the chief medical officer, the MHRA, who clearly are not fit for purpose. They've allowed 50 times more yellow cards to be built up for this vaccine than all the other vaccines ever over decades. So all these things, why did they not do their job? And I think it was pre-planned. They were going to do this. That's why they didn't want to see the evidence that I and others presented to them, and why they bullied people like me. Shut up, be quiet, or you lose your job, and they did do that. Doctors who wanted to treat patients properly and wanted to save them from the vaccine but struck off, like the famous Sam White case. That went to the High Court and was overturned. But the GMC still adopted this. This is what the government want. You go against the advice, you're dangerous, you need to be dealt with. And I know lots of doctors who've been in trouble for being sensible and wanting to do the right thing for their patients. When has this ever occurred? As I've said, I've been carpeted by the authorities several times, and I said, well, I will not deviate from what I believed I am as a doctor, and that's my first duty is first do no harm to the patients. And I suggested to the hospital trust, the Royal Colleges, they all think on that. And that's how they should be thinking, instead of mercilessly bullying good doctors trying to do the best for the patients. I mean, it's a dreadful, dreadful system we're in now.
With that in mind, and when you talk about a plan, what do you make? How do you assess the activities of, let's say, the World Health Organization in pursuit of this amended pandemic preparedness treaty and the international health regulations and so on and so forth? And if it would appear that if that doesn't get to where, to get to that chosen destination, the United Nations, are also working on a sort of a parallel backup plan to nudge everyone towards the same destination. How do you read that in terms of your burgeoning sense of a plan?
Well, first of all, with the World Health Organization, I flagged that up right at the very, very beginning, because of, all our data, and I've, written about it, written the book with colleagues on the origin of the virus, right from the way back. It was obvious this thing leaked from a laboratory. But it was obvious, again, that the WHO were not doing their job. If the WHO had been remotely competent, this virus infection would never have escaped out of China. And that's part and parcel of the complacency of the government. They did a thing called Signet I think it's Cygnus or Cirrus. It was a preparedness. How prepared are we for an influenza type thing escaping from Asia and attacking? How prepared are we? And one of the things that they decided was that the front line preparedness was so good that the chances of it coming to the UK and Europe were minimal. And so, nothing to worry about so much here. Now, we had SARS and MERS before, and the SARS and MERS did come from bats to humans through a pangolin in the case of SARS and a camel in the case of MERS. But the WHO handled the SARS very well at the time, I believe. It was a different head. It was Gru Harden. I can't remember her full name, but she was head of the WHO. And she criticised the way China did it mercilessly, that they should have done things better and what have you. So rather than take the criticism and handle the thing the next time it happened, SARS-2 came along, their attitude was, no, we don't like the WHO. They're meddling and interfering, etc. What we'll do is get rid of this woman that is causing us all this trouble, which they did. And as you know, the head of the WHO is the first non-medic to head this, and he was pushed by China for this role. And of course, the Ethiopians had a lot of reasons to be grateful to China. So I think this is real manipulation. They put this fellow in charge. So when this did break out again, he didn't do his job. I mean, in a nutshell, they prevented the WHO from doing the things. And of course, he couldn't do anything about it because he's beholden to China for his post and probably a lot of the funding. You see where I'm coming from now. So the WHO has been severely corrupted from within. And this idea that they would take over the management for the next pandemic and the next pandemic will come, I make no bones about this whatsoever. This is madness. They have shown themselves to be supremely incompetent and useless at handling the pandemic. And they've got some experts on who I have serious doubts about. Jeremy Farrar, he went along with this business of it's a terrible pandemic, what have you, when I know that very good, he was aware that the virus was probably an escape, etc. But he's now advisor of the WHO, so they're all in this together. I believe there'll only be another pandemic if the WHO have the authority to lock us all down and demand a vaccine route again. And that as soon as they've got that power, you will see another pandemic come. And I believe that this time it almost certainly won't be an accident. It will be part of the plan. And I just don't understand why they would do that.
So in what sense then, you use the word incompetent. Is it incompetence or is it malevolence?
Well, you see, I've always treated these things that, in fact, I coined the thing that I always resort to, Dalgleish's law of universal human incompetence when there's a crisis or a tragedy. And I'm very slow to look for the malevolence because I can't understand why. But I'm afraid you cannot ignore a malevolence behind this. I mean, why would you still be pushing these COVID vaccines, knowing that they cause nothing but harm? And not only do they not work, but they weaken people who get them. They can't work. And they get all sorts of autoimmune diseases, and now cancer is on the rise with him. It's very clear. And in spite of people like myself and many, many colleagues, we've explained. I mean, there's always associations with things, but that doesn't mean to say they're causal. But here, we don't need to look very hard to realise the vaccines and the cancer, because the boosters, other labs have shown they cause marked T-cell suppression. Not the first two, the booster. And that's the last thing you want in a cancer patient. In fact, they call it, one of the groups called it T-cell exhaustion. I thought that's actually a very good term, because you've overstimulated the immune system so much against the virus that doesn't exist. It's exhausted and it's just given up, it's had enough. And then another group of people, and this has been repeated by many other groups, is that you then get an IgG switch from antibodies that would normally neutralize the virus and kill it to antibodies that go, oh, You go ahead. We'll make sure everything's okay. And those are the antibodies that you induce if you want to tolerize a transplant. So if you've got a kidney transplant given you, our immune system is incredibly powerful, because if it's not well matched and the immune suppression's not well, I worked on one of these units. The kidney's literally thrown out of the body. It's really quite amazing how powerful it is. And in order to do that, you have to induce tolerization antibodies. Well, these are what the COVID vaccine's doing. So it's no wonder we get developing autoimmunity, and cancers are no longer being controlled, and they're the equivalent of injection. And now the real thing, and it's a major, major red flag, and nobody's listened to me, and I'm not alone. And that's the other thing, by the way, is the number of similarities between this and the sub-postmaster scandal is unbelievable. We're all seeing the same thing, but the people at the top saying, shut up, you're the only one. Well, I now find that with regards to my advice about that, treat this straight up, vitamin D, anti-inflammatories, you don't need lockdown, this, that, and the other. And I was basically pushed away as you're the only one. I find that, no, I wasn't. I've spoken to loads of people who said the same thing. And we're also ignored, and we are all senior physicians who are quite sensible. But we were all collectively ignored. This is the other thing that I just find it just so difficult to take.
When I listen to you as one medical professional talk, I've been in this strangely, I suppose, privileged position where via Twitter Spaces and all sorts of other fora that I've taken part in, I have heard all sorts of people like yourself who tell that story of seeing something for what they were convinced it was, and seeking to treat it as doctors do. And in that way of things, different doctors treat these things in different ways. And I was fascinated by talking to a Dr. Shankara Chetty, who he saw this thing coming at him or coming at his patient, and he saw a correlation, or he saw a sequence that suggested to him that it was a bit like the anaphylactic response to a bee sting. People were either getting better for him within about 7 days, or if they didn't, they got very steeply unwell after the 8th day, and so on. And what I'm saying is he was treating it with antihistamines.
Yes,
big doses of antihistamine. So what fascinates me is that this problem was being tackled by lone, brave medical professionals all over the place who were making their own deductions. And in any event, his large doses of antihistamine were hugely successful as well, such that Malaysia, the country of Malaysia, actually imported him to have him teach his protocol to Malaysian doctors. And they were so impressed by the effect that it had Dr. Chetty was actually awarded a sort of Malaysian medal for the contribution that he had made. But all these isolated islands of doctors who first doing no harm and just treating the person in front of them were all finding their way to these fascinating different solutions to the problem. If they were just left to operate as doctors.
Yes. And I mean, another thing that's well worth mentioning along with Dr. Chetty is Pierre Corey's work with ivermectin. I mean, this is the same story, but even worse. I mean, ivermectin, I know people who were very ill after a while, and all the other things that were not that useful, and they were put on ivermectin and they improved dramatically. And, who tried to stop ivermectin? Who said it was a horse dewormer, likely to be highly toxic? Anthony Fauci. What was going on here? There was all these things, logical things that you're treating a systemic overreaction. I mean, one of the things I'd like to remind myself, is to remind other people, is I don't know anybody else apart from myself who's actually at one stage or other been a consultant general physician, a consultant virologist, a consultant immunologist, and a consultant medical oncologist over the space of 35 years in the NHS. I've been all those things, the virology, because I ended up becoming an expert in HIV, and discovered the receptor and vaccine work. I did a lot of that. But the reason I'm saying that is one thing I've noticed all the time is the vast majority of diseases are not due to the infection or whatever else you think is the cause of the disease. The disease is the response of the body and the immune system to that agent. That is the disease. So everything, if you don't know exactly what to target, you target which bit of the immune system, like the histamine mast response, which Chetty was talking about, or the other responses. In the case of HIV, I mean, before we had all the drugs, which actually, when they did come in, the first wave, AZT, were worse than useless. But before we had that, you could treat HIV very well with steroids. I mean, people who were with AIDS, who were really ill, and I wrote that up fairly early on. So the disease was the response. And so it's the same thing with the COVID. When you're lying there really ill, it was the inflammation of the lungs that was killing you. It wasn't the actual virus per se. It moved on to this stage. So you needed to do everything you could to reduce the inflammation, and steroids is the one thing we know, dexamethasone, that does it. Now here is another piece of what I regard as gross incompetence, and that was the recovery trial. The recovery trial was the only treatment allowed in hospitals for patients admitted with COVID. So they were randomized out of Oxford, and took charge of this and the vaccine and everything else. They were randomized to 6 drugs, only one of which was dexamethasone. All right, this is very careful. If you were not on this trial, any competent physician would treat these patients with dexamethasone. But this trial prevented 5 out of 6 people getting dexamethasone, and it went on to show that the only drug that was any use was dexamethasone. My respiratory colleague calculated that this trial killed 4,500 people by denying them dexamethasone. This is the level of incompetence that I think that the country descended into. And that's what you would do with the dexamethasone and other agents with good anti-inflammatory activity, which some of them, bizarrely, include antibiotics. So there's a thing here that says, there's a thing we're told, you can't use antibiotics for a respiratory disease. But one of the things, if you look back in history and really learn, like the so-called Spanish flu, influenza in the 2018, they probably didn't die of the virus. They died of all the secondary infections, which today would have been greatly reduced with antibiotics. And I certainly will treat people with antibiotics who have a chronic viral infection that's looking like it's going to go to their lung, or etc. It's a logical thing to do, but everybody was told, no, don't do it, can't do it, etc. This is what I've just found just unbelievable, incomprehensible.
I've heard more than one physician talking about the Spanish flu pandemic, and saying that, and looking back and noticing that the symptoms at death of a lot of people did not really match up with what you'd expect from somebody dying of influenza. You know, there was a lot of instances of bluing of lips, of bloody froth at the nose, and so on. And long story short, that it was the mis and overprescription of aspirin, which at the time was relatively was new. There are many interesting parallels there, because at the time the governments and physicians and pharma got into bed together, absolutely persuaded of the efficacy of aspirin. But at a time when they didn't understand dosage properly, and there were anecdotal accounts of people having fistfuls of aspirin.
You got it in one. It's dose. A lot of drugs are very, very effective. I mean, I'm a great fan of aspirin. I think it's fantastic. But when I said, you use it for respiratory things, I mentioned you gargle with it. You don't need to take it systemic. You want that aspirin right. It blocks COX-2 inflammatory pathway. They're overexpressed there. That's where you want it. But if you was to swallow it, I would only do 1 a day or 2 at the most. but it's the dose. They died because they were hyper overdosed with the aspirin. I've read those papers.
But we've spoken. You actually invoked the Hippocratic Oath itself. First do no harm, and I think about hubris. I wonder at the extent to which some people who, by wealth or for other reasons, have got an absolutely out of proportion influence on events at the moment. The technocracy and the billionaire class, so persuaded of their own rightness, so victim to hubris, that they're pursuing a wider objective that actually is manifesting itself in doing harm. I do wonder that I've talked for my own reasons about an anti-human agenda that seems to be out there, and that there seems to be a class, a very wealthy class, that do seem to be increasingly treating humanity itself with contempt and a disregard. And I wonder at the extent to which you share with me a growing anxiety about a sinister presence that is anti-human.
Well, I do, and I've looked into it a lot, and I mean, some people trace it all back to the Rockefellers. Who was one of the very, very first, very, very rich people who got involved. When you have large sums of money, you influence things, and you try to call it philanthropy. I must say, the philanthropy that I've seen investigate very carefully seems to be very selfish. I call it selfish philanthropy, as opposed to philanthropy for the better good of various people. It tends to be very directed. And I must say that I was horrified, my own thing, with Tony Fauci. I've known Fauci since 1984. And I was there in 1984 because I discovered the receptor of HIV, and I was in the inner circle of the HIV group with Fauci and Bob Gallo and all those people. And I was there, and I thought, this Fauci, he seems to be, really bright on the ball, very loud fellow. But he promised the USA and the world an HIV vaccine within 18 months in 1984. In 2024, we still don't have it out of anything that he's funded and pushed. I believe that we do. That's alternative people who basically said that's not the way to do it. And the way that Fauci, NIH, all the big pharma have done, using repeated different variations of the envelope protein to make an HIV vaccine, which is failed, fulfills Einstein's definition of stupidity. And they still say won't walk back from that. But Fauci is a very cool person, because it was Fauci, we now know, bullied Farrar and Valence into accepting that this virus did not come from the lab. And they all meekly accepted that and went along. Why did he do that? That's what got me. Why did he do that? Well, we now know why he did it, because Obama banned gain-of-function work early on. And he had to say that he wasn't doing it, and he did. And Rand Paul has had a real go at him in the Senate hearings. You're probably aware of this, about that he lied about all this. And we now know that he did. He funded all the work indirectly through DASAX's Eco Health Alliances to the Wuhan lab, and probably others as well. And if he hadn't funded that, we wouldn't have dealt with SARS-2. We wouldn't have had it. Anything that hadn't been manipulated. That's why it got a kickstart. You see, putting these inserts in kickstarted it. Now, after the first phase, nature edits these things, so the next phases are much less dangerous. They may be more infectious because you put them down that path, but they're less dangerous. So we saw that as the COVID, the second virus wave, which then came out of South Africa, and it showed very clear. And at that time, we were in the second wave. They showed, in the South African Medical Association said, this virus, Omicron, is actually very infectious, but it's not remotely dangerous. In fact, it makes no difference if you're vaccinated or unvaccinated. It makes no thing. My immediate report to that is, thank God, here's the best vaccine you're ever going to get. It's airborne, it's mucosal, and it causes no side effects. But what happened? Our lot went on, we must have another lockdown. It went on, we must batten down harder, get more Nightingale hospitals. That's another thing, that we're completely stupid by Einstein's definitions. The first time they built the Nightingale hospital, they couldn't staff them, they were of no use. And then they went and built them again. I know that because the local hospital here, they did it. And I said, what are you doing that for when you can't staff them? He said, we've been told to. I said, it costs millions. Well, so we wasted so many billions on absolute. It drives me mad when we can't get simple little things funded, and the government and the whole of them wasted billions. And let's not go in here into any politics here. There was something going on across the whole board, because remember, we had no opposition. We had the Starmer and the Liberal Democrats were saying, go for it harder, lock down harder. You're being too kind. Just lock them up, throw away the key until the epidemic. So, I mean, they were even worse. So it wasn't like, so there was no debate on all this stuff. And people like me were just completely ostracized. I mean, people would cross the other side of the corridor in the hospital rather than have a debate with me.
Is it just about money? Is it just submission? Political class, the medical profession, media, everybody just submitting to money. And you mentioned, well, the word philanthropy.
Yes.
When you even begin to scratch the surface of what has happened in India, in Africa, under the aegis of, for example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Well,
you do have to ask it. Is that because, I mean, as we all know, Gates is not a doctor. He doesn't have a medical qualification, and yet he is absolutely the single most influential person in the field, and it can only be because of his wealth.
Exactly, and his ability to control Fauci. Because if you hadn't mentioned that, I was going to lead on how Fauci was meant to be the top doctor making these asinine decisions, about lockdown, school, masks, everything under the Koch interrogation. He's just said where they seemed like a good idea at the time, no, there wasn't any scientific evidence. And he's destroyed hundreds of millions of lives about this over these things. And he admitted there was no science. And then when he's pushed on the science, he can't remember. And I don't mean, I said, when I met him, I thought this guy is really up there. As I got to know him, I came across that he wasn't very good science. He basically had power. He had power and money and controlled who got funded and who didn't. So I then asked the question, why is the output of that funding so mediocre? Because it's not done on the meritocracy it's would. And this is where the big money comes in. It's Gates and Fauci were like that with regards to wanting to dominate world global health, what have you, with vaccines. They've interfered all over the place. And there's many people, and here I'm going to say, if you really want to look at all the details, I don't have time to give them, but if you want the details, I must take my hat off. I couldn't believe the amount of diligence and evidence that Robert J. Kennedy has produced in his book, The Real Anthony Fauci, which actually it only gives half the title. It should be The Real Anthony Fauci and The Real Gates. Because when you have that sort of money, people do what you want. They're desperate for money. I was looking for money for our HIV vaccine program, and I realized, we applied for the Gates thing and what have you, and our rejections, well, this is a very good idea, but we have a very good vaccine in worldwide trials now, so your plan B won't be necessary. Well, the vaccine failed. We'd had our plan B turned down, so we applied again. And they said, we've got it right this time. We don't need it. And I suddenly realized that everybody, when I discussed with some of the top immunologists in the world the plan we have for HIV vaccine, they said it's perfect. It's the ideal, really good. It was constantly turned down. I actually believe that this is basically the establishment of where the money goes, and that includes Gates.
How do we get the dog wagging the tail again, rather than the tail wagging the dog? We look on at someone like Gates, who has no meaningful qualifications, but he has infinite wealth. And so he's dictating world health policy as a sole trader.
Yeah.
And also, you then have, another significantly wealthy individual, say Elon Musk and Neuralink. This determination that Homo sapiens Mark 1 is suboptimal and must be upgraded using tech, so that you get into that transhumanist realm. How do we is there any hope of getting back to the dog wagging the tail, by which I mean doctors, however humble, the individual general practitioner clinician saying, I am face to face with this individual, I know what to do, rather than this top-down centralized policies that are coming from people, not because they're clever, not because they're qualified, but because they're rich.
And, there's somebody else who, you mentioned those two, who I suddenly realised is, I would say, another root of all evil, is Tony Blair. Has many similar properties to Gates, but without the enormous sums to give away. But he's someone who to interfere in all sorts of things and manages to get very rich people to fund him. And I believe he's got dozens, if not hundreds, of people working in his Tony Blair Institute, whatever it's called. Why? That's the big thing. Why? He tells governments how to govern. He was meant to be the leader for Middle East peace. A great job he did of that. And his big ideas have all been a disaster. Remember, he got in on education, and 50% of people going to university. I can tell you, as a university professor, that's been an absolute disaster. And we could predict that at the time. You can't suddenly go from 10 to 50%, in just a few years and expect everybody to be very good at that level. And I really do believe it's been a disaster, and we'd be better off with a great cull of universities and going back to technical type colleges. Every time I go to Germany, Berlin, I know that the big University of Berlin stands next to the big technical University of Berlin. They're equally proud. That's why there's still a great manufacturing base, etc., what have you. So I think that there's a lot of this interference by people who've got this massive influence, and they've got this massive influence because they managed to talk to people with money. And Gates is he's like a magnet wherever he goes. Everybody wants to talk to me, comes to Britain, he ends up and down the street. It's just incredible. Do
you think there is, you used the word cull there in relation to, significantly reducing the number of people, being lured into university for no particular good reason. Do you put any credence on the suggestions that are out there about there being an avowed intention to lower the population of the species of Homo sapiens?
Well, Gates' father was a eugenicist, wasn't he? That's very well documented. Vaccines. I've been working with vaccines for cancer and HIV, interested in the concept for a long time. It's been impossible to ignore. There's a lot of people want to use vaccines to stem fertility. And it would look very much like, if all the data that we're seeing is correct, that the COVID vaccines have been rather successful at that. There's about 13% drop in fertility in populations. There's been big rolls out. So I now believe you cannot ignore everything. I've always believed if you see evidence, you examine it and you go into it and you look for an association. Then you have a hypothesis and you say, is it causal? Is it related? Or is it indirect? Is it coincidence? What have you? I'm now no longer prepared to make knee-jerk responses like the Royal Society people did, who said it's obvious it came from a bat, when it was not obvious it came from a bat. The previous ones did doesn't mean to say the next one does. There's the difference, and there was a difference. Yeah, so I've got a totally open mind now, and I'm really horrified to read and see the logical implications of things like the WEF, World Economic Forum, that sounds like something I think should be banned to me, as far as I'm concerned. It seems only to subvert the rich. And the United Nations, I mean, it's the WHO I would disband. I don't think there's any need for it whatsoever. And the United Nations, I think, have also become a totally past the sell-by date organisation, capable of causing more harm than good, as we've seen some various things. So I'm not going to go into the details of the politics and things like that. But I think a lot of these things have to be treated with great suspicion and that's acted on accordingly.
I've had occasion to speak to several people about falling birth rates, falling fertility, and I've heard about societal factors, civilizational factors, but and also suggestions about vaccines and all of the rest of it. But it seems to me that there's this inescapable existential crisis. The data's already there that across Europe, North America, and all over Asia, people aren't having enough babies to maintain their populations. I see all sorts of darkness about places like Singapore and Japan. Their indigenous populations ceasing to be in a matter of a century or more if they remain in the tailspin that they're in at the moment. And yet, despite those inarguable, incontrovertible facts that the birth rates are down and fertility is down, we've still got this mood music from people like Gates and others that there are too many people. I don't see how those two facts can coexist in a logical universe. That populations are in tailspins in some parts of the world, and yet some of the wealthiest and most influential people are saying at the same time we need to do even more to have fewer people. How is that, if that's not anti-human?
Well, I mean, that's what it is. It is what it is the fact that they assumed this because they're very rich, and I've seen it before, and people have got Nobel Prizes. If they got Nobel Prize or something, they think they become experts in everything. And they think that they are duty bound to replace God on earth and dictate in what they see as a benign way without realizing it causes unbelievable damage and catastrophe doing some of the things that these people want to do. And, going back to, what else that they're on about, I mean, they also talk about that the populations are in the wrong places and all this sort of thing. That you need a good breeders and bad breeders and things like that. And it takes me straight back to the bookshelves to Brave New World, which is exactly where that lot were going. They only wanted to breed good people and get rid of the rest of them. I mean, it's real eugenics. And that's probably what Gates' father read. I don't know, I'm just speculating.
Eugenics never goes away, does it? From even obviously before the term was even coined, that has been a strain of human psychology, and it never leaves us, does it? There are always those who feel my sort of people are good, and we need to maintain them, but the rest are useless eaters, or they're surplus to requirements, or they're suboptimal and they need to be fixed or upgraded in some way. It is a constant background music to our existence, isn't it?
Yeah, and the other thing, putting that in perspective, it is very clear that the pandemic that we suffered through, which I don't think we should have at all, but has been the greatest transferer of wealth from the poor to the very rich in history. I mean, it's even better than the Napoleonic Wars, I mean, which was a fantastic transfer of wealth to the Rothschilds for being the bankers to the wars, etc. You see where I'm coming from. And I find that extremely disturbing. And the other thing is, these people, once they get very rich, they're not content. They want to have more and more wealth, more and more power. They just won't stop. They just won't give up. And that's what I find so frightening. because there has been, the big pharma profits, I think, were witness to that. I mean, it's absolutely disgusting what Pfizer and Moderna have done. We now know Pfizer, I mean, it's very well documented about the side effects, and Fauci was involved with this in the trials to the point where the randomization, was stopped. It was stopped because the vaccine was so good everybody should get it. Well, you might like to think that, but I say that they were stopped because the side effects were so bad that they would stand out like a sore thumb and never get approved. So all the people who were on the placebo were given the vaccine. So the side effects were equally as bad in both arms. So you could say that it's very safe. It's no worse than the placebo arm. A whole load of manipulation went on like that. And, I know you've talked to Claire Craig and my colleagues, other colleagues like that. I mean, I would say, why wasn't Claire Craig on the MHRA, because on the FDA? Because they presented this thing called relative risk, which anybody who really knows their statistics is real smoke and mirrors, when the only thing that matters is absolute risk. And the relative risk, they said, and it sounds good to politicians and doctors and colleges who are too lazy to do any work into the real facts of this, 95% effective. Oh, that's brilliant. That's fantastic. What's the absolute risk? 0.84. Well, I'm not a statistician. I don't understand that. But what I do understand is, hey, how many people do I need to vaccinate to stop one case of infection? The very best data was 119. What? For a virus that only kills 0.085%? Sorry, not necessary. Where were our gatekeepers? If Claire had been there, we'd all have been safe from this. I mean, I admire her so much. And she and Norman Fenton, have really gone through this data and translated it into really clear, we know what we're talking about now. And it's so good.
I'll let you. I'm going to try and draw this to a conclusion, Angus. But if I feel that if someone like me has woken up to so much of what is going on, and with my rudimentary understanding of science and so on, if so much of it makes sense to me now, then I take myself as an example of the reasonable man. Mm. Do you see signs that in the bigger picture, enough people are now seeing through and are awake to and paying attention to what's going on that we must now be able to start pulling the big wagon back onto the road to somewhere better?
Well, I do hope so. I mean, I've been involved with the Australian government. Have actually had a commission to look into the excess deaths over there. So that's one way of looking at it. And when you look at the excess deaths in Australia, there were no deaths from COVID. I mean, there was hardly any deaths at all, with just what you would expect with a really bad flu. The excess deaths correlate with the rollout of the vaccine program, and they're continuing to do so. And yet, safe and effective has been rolled out to shut people up. There's no evidence that they're safe or effective whatsoever, and yet they've used this mantra. Fortunately, there's some senators there who've woken up and they're not shutting up. And there's a wonderful Australian TV program which went out. I actually was sent it and saw it yesterday, where they actually had discussions. They had the equivalent of the MHRA there, fellow defending what was going on. But the audience was full of people whose lives were destroyed by the vaccine. People who had strokes, arthritis, autoimmunity, cancer, whatever. And so they are now waking up and addressing. And I know that from my own experience is that everybody has got a lot of cognitive dissonance to deal with, a hell of a lot, because this moved to realizing that it was blindingly obvious what was going on, but they all followed this party line mantra of fear. We must get vaccinated. We must stay back. I was amazed that sensible people followed all this, but now they're trying to reposition themselves that they were like this all the time. when I know they weren't. And I've got written evidence that they were.
We've all got the receipts. We've all got the receipts.
So yeah, it is moving, and it is what to do. Now, you touched on one very important point. I said I was involved giving evidence to the Australian government. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the Australian government, the regulators, the doctors, the medical professions, they're all guilty of gross incompetence in one way and the other. But you can't just lay that at them, because they will all say we were only following orders, this, that and the other. We should go for where the real criminals were. The real criminals were the people who are making the vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna, pushing them, knowing. I mean, you don't have to look very far to see that Pfizer have paid over £31 billion worth of fines in the last decade or two for withholding safety data, presenting false data, bribing clinicians and bribing regulators. It looks like they've been bribing everybody to get this message through. When anybody looking at the scientific evidence there, it does not stand up. So that's basically, people do need someone to blame on this, and I've done a lot. Where does it come from? It comes from Big Pharma and Fauci and Gates, all this stuff. And people have got to be held to account. And I believe Whitty and Vallance have to be, and Farrar, who all went along with this, and the SAGE, the most inappropriately named committee in the world, apart from NICE, they all made dreadful decisions, and they were all totally inappropriate. There were no proper practicing doctors in any of those committees advising about that. Neil Ferguson, with his ridiculous computers, making the most outrageous predictions. I can make outrageous predictions without a computer, but I don't expect people to listen to them. Where has he got listen to them? And everything he's done, as far as I'm concerned, I'd like someone to point out if he's done anything useful, but everything has been a disaster. The foot and mouth won't go on, etc. And yet, what do we find? He's just received an enormous grant to carry on as usual from the Gates Foundation. He has been funded by Gates to make these dreadful predictions. So it goes back to the central conspiracy. There's something going on here far worse than, we still haven't gotten to the bottom of it.
No, we haven't gotten to the bottom of it, but I think we're on the way. Professor Angus Dalgleish, I knew that was going to be inspiring, insightful, and I feel, yet again, I understand the situation a little bit more. So, Professor Angus Dalgleish, for now, thank you 1,000 times.
Thank you very much for having me.